early fashions in the lifetime of Maria Edgeworth. So today I'm going to discuss beliefs surrounding old age, particularly how old women were viewed by the rest of society, and what old women were expected to wear all during the late 18th and early 19th century, all the way up to the middle of the century. And that's where Carrie's going to come in and take over that part. Sorry, a bit winded from the stairs. So if you were here for my talk last year, I looked at the fashionable clothing in Maria Edgeworth's younger years. Maria was born on the 1st of January 1768, and she lived until the 22nd of May 1849, so which was of course a very long life for that period. And during her 81 years, fashion changed almost beyond belief. We cannot really comprehend how much it changed. Last year, I showed you the types of fashions that were popular in her youth. And this time around, we're going to look at how women in Maria's time tread the very fine line of dressing themselves in old age and trying to avoid looking like mutton dressed as lamb, while also not appearing ridiculous by wearing extremely outdated clothing of their youth. So to begin, we need to know what was considered the point between youth and old age in the period, as it's very different from our notions today. So modern dictionaries often define the middle age as the years between 45 and 60, right? So modern dictionaries say that. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, there was little recognition of the concept of middle age at all. Rather, there was an alarming hemorrhage of youth from the late 20s, with absolute old age appearing in women around 50. Yes, so old age was considered in women to be 50 years old. So in general, youth was perceived to end much earlier in women than in men. From a woman's 30s, her femininity was at an ebb tide. So conversely, medical experts, and I use that quote lightly, thank you very much, brilliant. I'll have a look and see, yeah, perfect, I'll run with it. Yes, perfect, thank you. I'm going to use this one instead. It's easier to read off of. So medical experts saw the years between 35 and 50, or even 35 and 60, as the epoch of manhood. So men were still like virile and considered, worthy, and even up to 60. Men were then in their prime in their 40s. Perhaps even their 50s, the very decades when women were visibly growing old. So in my opinion, this theoretical framework of a man being at his peak, even at 60, plays out in the large age gap relationships of the period. In Maria's own family, her father married his fourth and final wife when he was 58 and she was 29. I know. She was a year younger than his eldest daughter, Maria. So yeah, pretty grim by today's standards. So what we consider middle age today, by today's definition, was definitely old for the Georgians. And that trigger for old age in women was menopause. So the age at which a girl first started to menstruate was later than today, so maybe in her late teens. Evidence from the period, not that there's much of it, suggests that on average menopause probably occurred around the age of 50 or 51, which is very similar to today. If unmarried after 27, a woman was firmly in the category of spinster. And we see that in a lot of novels, particularly Jane Austen novels. An age of 27 is named for like Charlotte Lucas and Anne Elliot in Persuasion. So in the Georgian mind, a woman was ancient by 51, like definitely past it, over the hill. You might as well bury her now. So the physical markers of old age in women were primarily hair loss, tooth loss, wrinkles, and emaciation. So, extraordinarily thin. And women were heavily scrutinized, often by other women themselves. Maria was no stranger to passing judgment on how women her age displayed themselves in public, and it was often cutting. In 1830, she wrote about a fellow female novelist, Lady Charlotte Barry. She must have been a very fine, perhaps beautiful woman with a fair complexion and a bright colour, but on a very large, bold scale. And now the remains are melancholy, not interesting. She dresses too young and is not well made up. Her own grey hair coming here and there into view between the too evidently false masses of brown. Her own hair is dragged up some way so that it gave me a pain at my temples to look at her. Her mouth, once beautiful, is now all fallen in, and she is like a much-worn antique bust. So, meow! Maria wrote this when she was 63, and the woman she was writing about was just shy of 56. So, she was absolutely, jumping on this woman. But I do find it interesting she was a fellow female novelist, because Maria also had some critiques for other female novelists and their appearance, which I will get to in a minute. Oftentimes, the beauty and makeup routines of a woman's youth accelerated the aging process, which I will go into in a minute. Again, Maria writes a brutal description of a woman she met in 1831. Mrs. Cholmondeley's appearance shocked me extremely. I had known her at Mrs. Davis's, a rosy, pretty girl. She is like nothing living. She is like a corpse taken from the grave and clothed in mourning. She cannot live long. Mr. Holland told us that she and her sister Letitia injured their health irreparably by the means they have taken to preserve their complexion and beauty, starving and taking medicines perpetually. How foolish to sacrifice health, especially when there can be no beauty without it. I mean, actually, she's not wrong there. So I will add the caveat, though, that maintaining one's good looks was praiseworthy. Maria gave credit where credit was due, and in 1813, at a ball where there were scores of higher society ladies present, she wrote, "Among the old beauties, the Duchess of Rutland held her preeminence and looked the youngest." She honed in on the bosom of one attendee at the ball, writing, "The bust of Mrs. Greaves is still that of a fine woman." And giving up pretensions to youth was admired. Maria, when aged 54, reconnected with the Lady Salisbury, who was at that time 72 years old. She wrote, "She did not look like an old harridan with a face of wrinkled white chalk. That was my recollection of her, but no such thing. She's a very little, lively, good-humoured, darkish-faced looking woman, very alert and active. What did you think of her fox hunting past 70, though?" So this woman was still getting up on a horse on a daily basis at 72 years of age and chasing the fox. And as one aged oneself, the appearance of others gained a different sort of perspective. At age 62, Maria wrote, "By the way, 60 appears to me not at all old, rather the first bloom of old age, no more." Now, once a woman was past her prime, the conduct book of the period expected her to renounce praise and resign herself to neglect and invisibility. As we can see from the excerpts I've read, mature women who did not understand or follow the fashion rules were ridiculed. One short satirical poem from the time encapsulates the sentiment that unmarried old spinsters dressed too young in an attempt to hide their advanced age, using the deception to fool a man into marrying her. So, a fine Georgian poem for us now. "When age decays, fair beauties blaze unto the mantua maker," that's a dressmaker. "The prude with care she must repair, or no kind man will take her. Thus we contrive to keep alive the expiring flame of passion. So all adore, though full fourscore, our mutton dressed lamb fashion." So an 80-year-old woman trying to snag herself a young bachelor by basically rigging herself out in the latest fashions. This poem suggests an element of collusion between dressmaker and client, labouring together to hide a client's age through the latest fashions. But if slavishly following the new fashions was bad, rejecting new fashions and sticking hard to the fashions of yesteryear could be seen as absurd. In 1813, Maria wrote, "Mrs. Waddell is now huge and very plainly dressed old-fashionedly, but she must have been beautiful and graceful formerly." Years later, in 1830, Maria wrote to her stepmother of a mother and daughter duo she had met at a friend's house. And this was another female author, the Miss Crump. So she wrote, "Miss Crump was a very handsome, too magnificently dressed lady, about 30, and a squeezed up old poke bonneted mother that looks and speaks as though she had never been used to sit at good men's or women's tables. Again, don't hold back, Mariah. Like, tell us how you really feel. So just as a little visual aid, these are poke bonnets, the extremely long bonnets that basically hid the view, and you could only really see straight ahead. You couldn't really see side to side, kind of like horse blinkers in a way. And these had been at the height of fashion in 1807. So in 1830, when she wrote that, the mother was very definitely wearing something over 2 decades out of fashion. So such eccentricity of dress in women was never given a pass like it was sometimes in men. Prescriptive advice on appropriate dress did not assume that mature women of any status were going to abdicate the responsibility to still engage with new fashions. For the upper and middle class ladies, a lady's apparel still had to suit her rank and fortune, because dressing down undermined status and confused social hierarchy. Most commentators agreed that the nobility lived by different sartorial rules, which were not a model for every woman. So the richer you were, the more you could get away with. The higher up the social pyramid, the dressier a more mature woman was allowed to be. Now, advice literature from the period advised readers to face the remorseless facts of life. So to quote, "No woman is at 40 what she was at 20, not at 60 what she was at 40. Each age has an appropriate style of figure and of pleasing, and it is the business of discernment and of taste to discover and maintain these advantages in due season." All advice for women exalted modesty as the essential virtue. A woman whose clothes and manner invited too much male attention was hovering on the brink of dishonour. Now, just in case you thought it was bad enough to walk the tightrope of not dressing too young, looking old before one's time was also seen as eccentric. So reportedly, Jane and Cassandra Austen were thought absurd by their nephew for taking on overly spinsterish garb when they were still just in their late 20s. So overall, the rules of dress were contradictory and took considerable discrimination to interpret. Now, we're going to get down to brass tacks, basically. So there were certain colours, fabrics and trimmings which were more or less acceptable depending on the age and status of the wearer. So purple, which is my favourite colour, was an exalted colour associated with being seen as sombre and dignified, and it was less harsh on the skin tone than black. That's even fashion advice for nowadays, to wear dark purple instead of black. The informal garments of many widows after they cast off the first mourning was brown and blue. And we actually see, from my research in Mariah's letters, we actually see a good bit of brown in her wardrobe. And it was actually the first mention of colour in a letter that she wrote just before her 37th birthday. So like in her late 30s, she's transitioning to kind of the wardrobe choice colours of older women. Pink was highly fashionable in the 18th century Europe, but some argued it should be the preserve of blushing youth, as the colour invoked the rosebud and the maiden's blush. Rich daughters on the brink of betrothal or marriage were often painted in pink silk to kind of show their, that maiden's blush, all that sort of thing. Mary Delaney, who lived in Dublin, in the 18th century, considered pink unsuitable for a woman aged 52, which she was at the time of writing, which she considered to be very old age. She wrote, I think there is a time of life as well as station when very gaudy entertainments are as unbecoming as pink colour and pompadours. But older women could still incorporate age-inappropriate colours in different ways. So if a woman were partial to pink and to floral prints, she could still wear them if the flowers were pink, but it was against a dark background, like a brown or a black or even like a very dark green. That's how you could get away with basically still using your favourite colour, but with the sombre colours. Now, while older women's wardrobes heavily featured dark colours and were comparatively unassuming, they were still made of the finest fabrics money could buy. One such top quality fabric was velvet, prized for its soft texture and thick nap. All velvet at this period was made of silk, and it was astronomically expensive. Maria first mentions velvet in 1819 when she buys some black velvet for her stepmother and herself when they were respectively 51 and 52 years of age. As well as being a high status fabric, velvet was also a much warmer fabric than the sheer muslins and silks of the period, and people do tend to feel the cold more as they get older. Older women replaced girlish trims with jewellery given to them in marriage. It was often the trimmings rather than the clothes themselves that drew most of the mockery, which was potentially frustrating to stylish dames because changing fashions were more easily and inexpensively followed through ribbons, handkerchiefs, and net headgear. Accessories allowed a woman to retrim an old dress for a fraction of the cost of making a new gown. So what was considered vulgar in a mature woman was showing the décolleté, obvious makeup, especially rouge, that's very French, ribbons, ruffles, flounces, elaborate headdresses, as well as bareheadedness, don't be showing off your grey hair, the colour pink, and anything too French. But few things were as ridiculous as an old woman with a headdress of flowers. Such embellishments befitted virgins on the marriage market, but after the triumphal bridal appearances, it was time to put the fripperies away. Women were supposed to concern themselves with dress before their marriage, but thereafter women were expected to display their taste in dress on their children. Since floral motifs like this, either woven or embroidered, were exceedingly popular for decades, it was mostly keeping like large flowers away from the face, so that an unfair comparison between blooming flower and maturing skin could not be made. So does that sound like fun to anybody? So we're going to begin our a more physical explanation in the year 1808, when Maria was 40 years old. The prevailing fashion of the time was the bib front gown, which is in fact what I am wearing. Now I did say I would talk about the beauty routines of the time, so I'll quickly transition over to that. The Regency period was a time of much less obvious makeup, unlike the Georgian period, which had the very white skin, incredibly rouged cheeks, and even a variety of beauty spots to hide, pockmarks or whatever. By contrast, in this period, it was much more a fresher face. So women would often, first thing in the morning, ring for a maid to bring in a bowl of warm water and some soap and a muslin cloth. They would wash themselves. They might try to soften the skin with, this is called cream of roses. It's essentially a cold cream. Does anybody remember cold creams? Yeah. So they would apply that and then wipe that off to kind of soften the skin. And then it was very much just the application of a light bit of powder. We don't need any rouge in this period. Now this is pearl powder. But rice powder was also incredibly popular. So we're going to give a light dusting of powder. It should really only serve to kind of mattify and brighten the skin. We don't want it too obvious anywhere. We're not caking it on like in the Georgian period. And then a tiny bit of rouge for the cheeks. Or not the cheeks, I tell a lie. Just the tiniest bit of colour for the lips, basically. And again, just the most barest application of that.
What's that made from?
We'll have to get on to that later on. There's quite a lot of different recipes at the period. Some were toxic and some were not. So then, the kind of focus of the Regency period, in the Georgian period, like a nicely moon-shaped eyebrow was what you went for. In the Regency period, the focus went to the lash line. So of course they didn't have mascara, and they didn't really have eyeliner pencils like we have nowadays, but what they did have was kohl. So I've got kohl here, which is very fine powder, and I forgot the pin, but I'm going to demonstrate with this, even though they absolutely did not use a quill. But what they would do is they would use an ivory pin, right? And you would heat the tip of it with the breath to slightly warm it and dampen it, and then dip it in the kohl and then apply it to the lash line. It takes a lot of practice, and you definitely don't want to do it with your actual clothing on, because if it spills, it will really ruin your clothing. Perfumes of the time tended to be some of them were very simple. This is orange flower water. They rarely actually scented the body. What they tended to do was scent their linens instead and put those on. So that would be one thing you would perhaps scent onto your body linens first, and then put that on for a nice smell. Now, speaking of linens, I will finally get down to the layers of clothing. So once the beauty had been done, you were going to get dressed. Now, this gown that I'm wearing is called, well, we call it a bib front gown, because the front of it is essentially like a bib. And I will start to remove this. So it ties at the back, and it's basically just a panel that comes up. It's pinned at the front, and then it has a drawstring. And so this gown has two flaps then, which basically go in the center to kind of secure it at the front. These are held with pins. A lot of women's clothing is pinned at this time period because pinning was quite adjustable. Women, of course, could face quite a lot of body changes, not just pregnancy, but also just regular changes throughout the course of the month. So you wanted your clothing to be highly adjustable. Men's clothing tended to feature buttons, women's less so, because you can't really fluctuate your body when you're wearing buttons. You have to kind of stay the same. So this is the morning gown, and you can see I had a neck handkerchief on over the top of it. During the daytime, you should really have that décolleté covered, both for modesty and of course if you're going out in the sun for a bit of sun protection. In the evening, when it is appropriate, then at that time to basically, you can bare the bosom at that stage. Also during the daytime, it was more appropriate to have long sleeves, but these gowns did not necessarily have full-length long sleeves. They would have short sleeves, and then you would have basically false sleeves that you would just tack on with huge stitches for the morning time. And then let's say you were wearing it in the afternoon, or if you stayed in the gown all day long, you could just snip the thread, pull that out, pull the long sleeves off, and you didn't have to do any huge costume change to change your clothing. So that would be a gown very fashionable when Maria was about 40 years old. Now, the undergarments of the time, we have a shift, which you can just about see the sleeves here. These are going up over the shoulder. The shift went down to about the knee, and it was the layer that you put on, and this is what absorbs all of the body's sweat and oils and effluvians, and that's what gets changed every day. The reason it's called a shift is because when you remove it, you shift the dirt and the oils and the stainage away. These were made of cotton in this period predominantly. For hundreds of years, for millennia actually before this, linen had been the fabric that was the fabric of choice, but with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved labour, cotton became falsely cheaper, it was artificially cheaper, and therefore even in Europe became cheaper to wear than linen. Then over that I've got the stage, which you could just about see here with the bust cups, but they end right here, if you can possibly see that line under the petticoat, and these get laced up the back, as you can see. You can probably just about see some lacing, and in them, after you have finished putting them on, there's a channel here in the center. You insert a busk, right? So this is a wooden example of a busk. This goes in to help get that lift and separate that was popular in the Regency period, as opposed to the lift and squish together of the Georgian period. And you want to put this in after you've tightened to the level you're going, because otherwise it's very difficult to get that level. This is what helps you pin things in without getting to the body, because there's that hard surface there to act as a preventative or a barrier between your skin and the pins. So then over that goes a petticoat. I've got one style of petticoat, kind of in the 18-teen style, as we get a bit more interest around the hem with pin tucks, but this would be a typical cotton petticoat of the period. And you might think to yourself, well, they must have been freezing all of the time. In fact, I'm going to put this back on because it's not that warm in here. And what you could do instead to adjust to the weather basically was to have a wool flannel petticoat. Now, there was quite a lot of kind of, I would say hatred, but real antipathy to wool flannel. If any of you remember Maria Edgeworth in Sense and Sensibility, absolutely freaking out about Colonel Brandon because he's so old, because he talked about wearing a wool waistcoat. This is a wool petticoat. You can see it's a very fine flannel. It's quite thin, but it's quite warm, and it's shaped just like the other petticoats of the period that you could wear in the winter. So, like I said, Marianne Dashwood, flannel was essentially associated with old age, and people tried not to let anybody know that they were wearing it. It was, you know, a scene with age and sickness and the sick room and all that sort of thing. So young people eschewed it, even if it meant they were going to freeze. And people, I looked at one account recently of a woman in Dublin, again in the 1760s, and she, when she was in her 40s, started purchasing flannel for petticoats. So kind of finally giving in her mid-40s to, succumbing to the cold and basically old age. So once you have all of these things on, we've also got basically hose or stockings. So these came in a variety of colours. Silk was the preferred thing if you were wealthy enough and could afford it, but obviously wool stockings also were, you know, very much a thing in the winter. You might even layer your wool stockings over your silk stockings just to be warm, but to have the nice softness of the silk. So finally, that style of gown, that style of gown wouldn't remain super fashionable for much longer after 1808. From about 1810 onwards, we actually see a trend in gowns that fasten at the back instead of the front fastening of the bib front gown, either with buttons or ribbons. That became the dominant style at that period. Skirts also got shorter. We had trains in the 1790s and even into the early 1800s, but now skirt hemlines start to rise, and we start to get a lot more visual interest in the hems of the period. So rows of flounces and all sorts of things, like you can see on this gown. I've got 3 rows of white flounces decorating the bottom of the gown to give it a bit of movement. Oh, never mind. No, it's grand. I just realised this is front fastening. So you can see from this walking skirt that this is an upper bodied petticoat, in that instead of just having straps, it's got a tiny bit of basically this fabric here. It's got proper straps, it's got a proper back to it. So this provides a bit more kind of coverage, but again we still have the fastening at the front, and you might notice now that I'm going to use the busk essentially to pin these linen flaps without sticking into my body. So this is how this goes. That provides a little bit more support for the bust as well. And yes, essentially I have my skirt on now. I'm just going to put on my Spencer so I'm not sitting here.
Just ask, where did the stays come from? Were they made to measure, or did you buy them, or what?
Oh, I mean, you bought them, but you bought them off a stay maker who measured you and took several measurements, and you know, you would take fittings and you would be there and they would be draping things on you. I actually looked at those accounts I was looking at that I just mentioned about the flannel petticoats. That woman, her name was Mary Matthews, and she was getting a pair of stays made every single year. And then as she was kind of, her last few years, she was getting a pair of stays made like every 2.5 years. So she was kind of like slowing down a bit on that. But I mean, you would have worn them every day. So I'm just going to cover my décolleté, because this is day wear, with a chemisette, and then I'm going to put on a little jacket called a Spencer to be properly attired for going out walking. Now this particular ensemble is called walking dress, and the reason it's called walking dress is because of the shortness of the skirt. You don't have the train to get all muddy and dirtied, and walking was an extremely popular pastime. Women from the period really enjoyed it, really loved it. Many accounts of the period talk about walking. Of course, Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice is extraordinarily famous for her love of walking. And you could see this would form a very suitable form of walking dress, specifically for the year 1813, which I based on a fashion plate from the period. And realistically, I don't need the cap. Caps were really only worn kind of indoors by married women. Now, if you were like definitely a confirmed spinster and well past the age, you might start wearing caps. We see from several of Mariah's photographs and portraiture of the period, she was wearing caps even though she was never married. But it was just a sign of respectability and, unassuming, female advanced age.
And was it to cover the grey hair?
It would serve that function for an older woman, but even younger women, as soon as you were married, you were kind of expected to wear caps at home, and just to show. There was a lot of times, like for instance, Mariah and her stepmother were 1 year apart, so somebody meeting them in person might not know who was the daughter and who was the mother of the very elderly father, so the cap would denote Mrs. Edgeworth's marital status, while Mariah would be uncovered, and so you'd be like, okay, she's an unmarried woman versus a married woman. So it's kind of a visual symbol of status, without having to explain who's who. So, like I said, the skirts got shorter and we see a lot more trim, like flounces at the hems of gowns. Now this could be a cause for debate for older women, whether or not they should follow this trend. Was it too girlish? So in 1813, Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra, who was then 40 years old, "You must really get some flounces. Are not some of your large stock of white morning gowns just in such a happy state for a flounce too short?" Jane was suggesting Cassandra have an old muslin gown that was out of fashion cut up and the fabric used to make flounces on a new gown, which was an economical way to incorporate the latest trends into a wardrobe. Women also had their existing gowns dyed to follow the latest trends in colour. In that same letter, Jane wrote, "I have a great mind to have my blue gown dyed some time or other. It is the fashion of flounces that gives it particular expediency." Now, Cassandra evidently took Jane's advice, because a few weeks later, Jane wrote again asking, "How do you like your flounce? We have only seen plain flounces." This trend in hem flounces continued for quite a few years, because in 1815, Jane wrote again to Cassandra, who was now 43, "I am glad you have put a flounce on your chintz. I am sure it must look particularly well, and it is what I had thought of." Now, this ensemble that I have on, like I said, is called a walking dress. The petticoat or skirt is slightly shorter than ankle length, so it doesn't get muddy, but you can see it does, I know you can't really see at the back, but you can see it does provide nice movement as you walk, to have like this visual interest at the bottom. It cuts a dashing figure while strolling about town for exercise or shopping. And with that, I have the little spencer and a matching flat wool bonnet that took inspiration from the Scottish tam o' shanter. Have you, familiar with that? Perfect. This was a form of undress, which was informal clothing worn during the day for informal activities. This is opposed to full dress, which was formal clothing worn during the evening for formal activities like balls, the opera, or the theatre. So if you showed up to like an opera or a ball wearing this, they'd be like, there'd be some letters written about you, let me tell you that much. Now, it wasn't only flounces that were popular in the 1810s. From having long trains to shortening considerably and being garnished with rows and rows of lace and trims. Skirts grew shorter and rounder at the bottom and more streamlined just under the bust. There had been a lot of fabric previously, but now they started cutting the fabric. Instead of using flat rectangular panels, Carrie, can you help me? I'm tied up. Instead of using the entire rectangular panel of a fabric, they would cut trapezoids, so it would be narrower at the top and wider at the bottom. This meant you could have a huge skirt volume at the bottom and basically not have all the bulk of gathering fabric just under the bust. Oh my God, did I really tie a big knot in it? Hold on. Okay. Woo, released. Sorry. So during the daytime, women, especially mature women, covered up that neckline with garments or things like a chamisette. That was the little white frilly thing I was just wearing. This is called a chamisette, although there's debate about that. But in 1804, Maria called one a chamisette. So they would cover that during the daytime to basically, like I said, protect from the sun, but also to, for modesty's sake, I'm going to need you to hook me into this. So we can see here now, we have what's kind of the quintessential Regency white gown. Again, this gown has long sleeves for daytime. Now these are actually set in, so they're not the false sleeves, but it simply goes on over the head, and instead of the front fastening like we had in the decade before, now we get back fastening. So rows of buttons or two laces tied top and bottom of the very short bodice basically was the fastening. So now you really do need to have somebody help you get into your clothing, unlike the bib front gown where, you know, you can mostly do it yourself. But this is indeed what sisters and guests who are staying with you, or, you know, a lady's maid is for, to do this bit of it. You could see as well that a bit of visual interest would be introduced with things like contrasting ribbons that would be tied around the waist. And we see some lovely fashion plates from the period with lots of ribbons focused on the wrists. This was kind of a new development in where the visual interest was being displayed. Oh, good woman. Can you wrist tie me, please? I had about 2 silk ribbons there. Am I? I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. We'll find it later.
Can I ask a question? What's a fichu?
So a fichu is the French word basically for a neck filling in device. And good English people didn't use the word fichu basically. Not if you were, you know, a good subject basically. But as well as like a chamisette, a good old fashioned neck handkerchief also was in vogue. So this would basically, like the purple one that I started out wearing, would cover in, fill in the neck. And this would help for daytime, and of course you could remove this for evening time and still wear the same outfit. Again, very small scraps of silk here would be used to either silk ribbon, or bits of silk would be made into bows, and this would again provide, you know, that bit of visual interest. Ladies didn't have the extensive wardrobes that we have today. They had very often times 1 or 2 gowns. Well, not 1 or 2 gowns, that's a very gross under exaggeration. They had much fewer gowns than we have nowadays, and they would have a lot of accessories, like in the dozens. They would have, you know, 24, 36 of the shifts. They would have several petticoats. They could again have like neck handkerchiefs and chamisettes and things like this by the dozen. 36 again seemed to be a very popular number. If you figure that's basically 1 a day, with a few spares, you know, for between laundering, because laundering wasn't also the most frequent thing. You could basically go a month and then hand a month's worth of washing to the laundress to be taken care of. So like ribbons would go around the cuffs, and again you could change out the ribbons. I'm particularly wearing black at the moment. If you were in mourning but you weren't of a very close relation to the person who had passed, you might just give a nod to the fact that somebody in your family circle had died by wearing some black ribbons, but without going the full head to toe black like a widow or a child, that sort of thing. So these were ways to incorporate fashion. Now again, this might be worn while walking out. Oh, I found the other one. Perfect. This might be worn while walking out, and in the summer you could accessorize this with one of the very sheer and highly embroidered muslin gowns of the period. Perfect. These were highly sought after, incredibly desirable things that came from India. The muslin was so sheer you could see through it, and complete with white work embroidery. You could of course wear this as you walked out and about to show off your wealth and provide the slightest bit of warmth, but really not much warmth. If you did want warmth, what you're going to wear is a cashmere shawl, again imported from India, usually embroidered just like this. Kashmir being the region in India, Pakistan sort of area that produces the wool, I believe it's actually goat's wool, for these shawls. And we see a lot of fashion plates from this period, from the mid 18 teens, so 1814, 1815, with a brightly coloured shawl. And if you are outside, it is absolutely imperative that you have an absolutely stunning and over-the-top sort of bonnet on your head. Bonnets, again, were a great way to keep up with the latest fashions. But as an older woman, again, perhaps a more dark colour, or maybe not the flowers, to maybe don't have the flowers right next to the face. Definitely don't wear fresh ones. You could have silk ones. That would avoid an unfair comparison. But this would be a perfectly stylish outfit for walking out and going shopping, visiting in people's homes, which was, of course, a huge pastime that wealthy women engaged in, and the Edgeworths engaged in particularly. So, like I said, this type of daytime fashion could be worn while visiting friends and going shopping, something that Edgeworth women did a lot of. Women shopped not only for themselves, but for their friends and relatives too. I could read you dozens of quotes from Maria's letters where she either purchased fabric for her loved ones back home, or asked loved ones who were going up to cities like Dublin or London to get fabric for her. This is how we know so much about what colours and types of fabrics they wore, since they explicitly wrote them down in their letters of request, or reports on how they got on with their shopping. It was in 1819, when Maria was in England, that she purchased that velvet fabric for both herself and her stepmother. And after describing how she had packed them to protect the fabric, she wrote, "Now then, having this respectable dress at this time for myself has been of real comfort. When I have not had time to think about it and yet wanted to make a good appearance, often I have popped into my black velvet suit with such joy at being sure of being right and of being admired and envied. Think how comfortable." This shows us the dress was not just a matter of having clothes on body, but a state of mind, knowing that you yourself were appropriately attired for your age and station in life, no matter what company you find yourself in. So like I said, when going outside, you wanted to style it, with perhaps a shawl, definitely a bonnet. If the weather was really cold, and I know it's never cold in Ireland, you're going to perhaps put on a red cloak, a scarlet cloak. This would provide quite a bit of protection against the elements. It is incredibly warm, and the fashion for scarlet cloaks lasted much longer in England and Ireland than they did in the rest of the continent. Kind of a bit of an anomaly, but again, incredibly warm, incredibly bright and eye-catching. Again, for the cold, if you were, it was absolutely Baltic outside, whether you were walking or in a carriage, you would have a gigantic fur muff. This is incredibly small compared to the muffs of the period. They were positively enormous. But if you think about it, these dresses are of the sheerest, thinnest muslin. There's hardly any warmth in them. If you're sitting in a carriage or walking, this thing is going to be sitting on your lap, covering down to your knees. It's going to keep the vital organs warm, and essentially you're covered in a fur lap blanket. And even if walking, this would block any sort of wind coming at you. They often sometimes had secret pockets in them that you'd keep letters in, if you were going to surreptitiously pass a letter to somebody as you were taking a walk. But also for sun protection, it was vital when you were out on your stroll, whether you were shopping or what have you, to have a little parasol to provide shade for your delicate visage so you don't get tanned or any sort of a sallow looking complexion. So that would be basically some of their outdoor activities. Now, the Edgeworth were not homebodies, right? Who stayed at home and embroidered all day. Like many women of their status, they travelled extensively all over Ireland, England, and even France, staying with friends and family members of their large acquaintance for a week or more before moving on to the next group of friends in another big country house or to London or Bath. Travelling could be very dusty, bumpy and cold, and so women did not wear these flimsy gowns while travelling long distances by coach. Instead, they wore what's called the riding habit. So initially, these sturdy ensembles of wool in dark colours were adopted as travel wear in the 18th century for women who actually rode horses, but they were adopted as travel wear in the 1780s. By the 1810s, when Maria and her family were travelling all around England for like over a year, this was the standard ensemble for all sorts of outdoor pursuits, like going on boating parties, like we see Jane Fairfax in Emma, fox hunting, like that woman who was 72, who was still fox hunting, riding horses and travelling long distance. So it's very masculine look in comparison to the frilly white look that I'm sporting myself. And the ensemble is comprised of a petticoat, so you can see the skirt of it here, quite long, about 4 inches longer than the wearer, so that it would completely cover the feet and ankles when you're astride on horseback, because God forbid women have feet and ankles. It also had what's called a habit shirt. If I can just open this quickly. This was kind of similar to a men's shirt. This would be worn over the stays and tied around the waist. It did not have sleeves, or some of them did, but this one doesn't. And then a man's cravat would be tied around the neck. This would often be topped by something like a top hat, very similar again to men's attire, although we do see images of the period where women are wearing bonnets and riding habits on their okay, so we gotta go quicker. Right, okay. Now, boredom while travelling is nothing new, and people contrive to keep themselves entertained on these long journeys, just like we do nowadays. One popular pastime was reading. In 1813, just after Pride and Prejudice was published, Maria wrote, "Now we are again on the London road. Nothing interrupted our perusal of Pride and Prejudice for the remainder of the morning. Until we reached Epping Place by dinner time, I am desired not to give you any opinion of Pride and Prejudice, but to beg you all to get it directly and read it and tell us what yours is." So reading while travelling in a carriage was an extremely popular pastime. And here I have an actual book published in 1803, which gives a description of all the different towns you would pass through if you were riding post-chaise. So it gives funny little descriptions of the various towns. I have to say Edgeworth town gets a very small mention. They don't go into much detail. There's nothing particularly funny about what they wrote. But while you were sitting travelling, it would be thinking, okay, we're 3 miles from Newport, which is on the road to Castle Connell, that sort of thing. Again, another form of entertainment. Now, once you got to your friend's house or to wherever you were travelling, evening entertainments were extremely frequent, including balls and all sorts of things. Now, of course, women had very dedicated ball wear for these types of occasions. Carrie, hold on, let me keep reading while you undress. Now, oh, where did it go? Bugger. Anyway, we'll just keep going. So women had to wear their most formal ensembles, and by the time we get to the mid to late 18 teens, so when Maria was firmly hitting 50, the fashion at the time was for this new type of fabric called net. Now, net was made before this, but it had always been made by hand. It was extremely laborious and labor intensive. And now this man had basically patented a machine that would make net production much quicker. And we see the popularity of net actually explode. Now, because net is even more see-through than the sheer muslin was, it was always necessary to wear a gown under it. This gown was often made of silk, and it was called a slip. Kind of like the slips you might have been used to, like a gym slip, but made of silk and not at all, staticky or uncomfortable. And oftentimes very extraordinarily brightly coloured slips, like in a screaming yellow satin, would be worn because then the the net that went over it would kind of give it a pastel appearance. The net was often extremely highly embroidered. Just leave it untied. It's not crucial to life. The net was often extremely highly embroidered, or sometimes again there would be flounces and all sorts of silk ribbons and what have you at the bottom. I can't get this done. We're just going to leave it. If you can get the net off the table. Now, Maria owned several net dresses. She frequently wrote about them. In 1819, she basically had written about wearing a brown and white net ensemble. I don't know if that means that the slip was brown and the net was white. We don't know if that means that the net was white with brown embroidery on it, because we do see examples like that from France. So there were basically all sorts of ways that could be interpreted to mean. But this is my interpretation of a net gown worn over a slip that would be very popular to wear to a ball gown or an evening entertainment, and would be something that Maria, even in her 50s, was wearing, because we know that from her letters. Now, one thing that older women did to disguise hair loss was they would, because balls were supposed to be the most, opulent occasions, tiaras, really expensive, gorgeous jewellery would be the order of the day, dripping with jewellery and things. But the hair, of course, also has to be quite opulent. And if you're an older woman with grey or thinning hair, one marvellous way to counteract this is what's called a turban. So a turban would cover basically over the greying hair, or the thinning hair, and oftentimes older women would buy fake hair in the colour of their hair when they were young, and they would pin these fake curls to their hair to make it look like they still had their younger hair colour. Now, younger women also used fake hair. That wasn't at all uncommon. In fact, Maria's sister Fanny, who was only in her 20s, wore fake hair to a ball. And then to really kind of match in with the dress, they would often have like a fabric like this to make it even more turban-like, and wrap it around the head, which I'm going to do very badly because I can't see what I'm doing. And again, feathers and what have you would be adorning and showing off the real wealth. Now, by the time we get to 1820, and I'm not going to change into this gown, we see a real shift in fashion. Maria is still keeping up with the fashions, but we have darker colours now, and we also have a dropped waistline. So instead of being right under the bust, like you've had for over 20 years at this stage, we start to creep more towards the natural waist, and we get a much larger hem. And this is done not with skirt supports like you see in the 18th century, but this is done by adding something called rouleau to the bottom of the gown. So basically rows of fabric stuffed with wadding that really help to hold the skirt out in a circular shape without basically wearing structural undergarments like panier and things from the 18th century. And now I'm going to pass you over to Carrie to talk about Maria's even later fashions.
So one of the, as Melissa just led into, we're heading into what's termed the Romantic period. So as well as having changes in fashions, a lot of these are led by changes in sort of the sentiment of the period. And Romanticism, classicism is kind of on the way out, Romanticism is coming in. And you get this divide with sort of, romantic music, romantic poetry, and like the romantic poets were extremely popular at this stage, different romantic novels and things like that. And this is all also reflected in the dress of the time. In terms of the underwear, we'll start out with my unfortunately slightly badly dressed one. So the shift that Melissa would have worn is quite plain with a plain neckline. In this period, it's always very difficult to talk about fashion, I feel, because nothing changes exactly on a certain decade. You're going to get shifts where, shifts in fashion where you're going to have some slightly older styles and some slightly newer styles all being worn at the same time. What we start seeing to moving into in the period is you get a smaller sleeve on the shift with potentially a little cuff on it. And what this is called on the shift is a yoke. So it's a separate piece at the top that adds a little bit of decorative. Then it's usually opened here. The rest of the shift then falls down from there, but you've got a much sort of more open but decorated neckline and slightly more fitted sleeves. Over this we have essentially a long line set of stays or corset, and this would have come in through the period as Melissa had short stays and had shown those, and she also was wearing a long set of stays. A lot of these are stiffened with actual cording, as well as the busk at the front, but it gives a slightly smoother appearance than the boned corsets that you see later in the period. So I have my busk here. I'm going to slip in. And these corsets, the word corset does start to be used much more frequently from this period on. Of course, I won't go into it. So yeah, the word corset does start to get used from sort of slightly more than this. You have stays is the more common term, but corset does begin to get used, and you see it in adverts cropping up. And then sort of as the period goes on into the middle of the century, corset becomes the more frequently used word. And over this, we are going to put a petticoat, several petticoats. Again, we're quite far away from the crinoline. So the crinoline would have come in the 1850s, and it was usually made out of horsehair. And then you had some hooped crinolines. But a lot of what was achieved in the shape of the period, which you're going from quite a columnar, very sort of refined, classical, very straight up and down style of dress. In the 1820s, as we're moving into Romanticism, as Melissa pointed out, you get that wider hemline, more of an A-line. And then as you come into the 1830s, you get much more of a bell shape. It's a rounded top on the skirt. It's not the full-on 1860s and 1850s, but you basically had to wait for that technological advancement of the crinoline skirt, the hooped crinoline. So instead, women relied on just heaps and heaps of petticoats, basically. So this one is corded, and would have been starched in the period as well. So again, like the corset, it's got rows and rows of rope essentially sewn into channels along here. And when you have enough of those around, the skirt kind of stays, it holds itself out. And you would add starch on top of that to make it stiffen up and to make it stand out a little bit more. So you get this nice soft bell shape from that. Women would essentially have one sort of stiffened petticoat in terms of the corded one, and then you would add a number of other types of petticoat onto that to sort of puff out a little bit more. So you can see eventually why when the crinoline came in, it did pretty much revolutionise fashion, because women were less encumbered by the layers and layers and layers of petticoats that they would have had to wear in the preceding period.
But that didn't come in Mariah's lifetime.
No,
she died in 1849, about 4 or 5 years before the crinoline was invented. So she never got the ease. No.
So then on top of this, again, much of this is white cotton, and you have under petticoats which would have tucks, which are sewn in. Again, they do add some stiffening to it, and they act as a little visual detail as well.
Who was going to see it though?
Oh, you would be first to end.
I find that at the time, for me personally, an awful lot of this detail is hidden, but then by the same token, everyone else would have understood that there was this level of detail put into it. A lot of women's work in the period in the house would have been things like making shifts, making petticoats. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of the domestic linens in the house and the household underwear linens would have been made by women in the house.
You could purchase them. There were ready-made things for sale, but it was still largely done by the women at home.
And it was considered an accomplishment for women to be able to have neat needlework. In the 1830s, a book gets published called Workwoman's Guide. Now, it was largely aimed at younger women, middle-class women who were just becoming wives, and it gave them sort of all the instructions on the linens that their household would need. And I was looking at it the other day, and it's actually amazing the depth that it does, because I had actual household linens like bed linens, kitchen linens, pillowcases, sheets, all of these kind of things, how many of each you should have, how to make them up. It comes with little patterns diagrams of patterns. It gives shifts, shirts, drawers, all of these kind of things were listed in it. Shrouds, how to make a shroud, how to make clothes specifically for Quakers, and part of it as well was this idea of industriousness. But you weren't just making them for yourself, so there's also instructions on how to make clothing or underwear for poorer people, and that would be done as an act of charity. To help make the skirt stand out a little bit more, we have the bustle. So this is quite different from the bustle that you might know from much later in the period. But the bustle does start in around the 1830s. And again, this is something that the instructions come from the Workwoman's Guide, where it's essentially a doubled over layer of a stiff cloth like jean. So jean was a fabric that was there at the time. And it's essentially a thick cotton twill. So again, stiffened with some cord. And we put this on over to make the back stand out just a little bit more. And the weight of all of the skirts can tend to drag things down slightly. So we put a little extra bounce in with that.
As opposed to a crinoline, which weighs 1 kilo.
Yes.
So like 1 kilo versus many kilos.
Lots of
kilos.
For the sake of proudness. I find pockets fascinating. So this is what's called a tie-on pocket. And this would have originated actually quite earlier than Melissa's period in the Georgian period, and these were worn under women's clothes largely, and their clothing didn't always contain pockets. So they wore a tie-on pocket, which has a slit here that you can put things in, and these actually come in many different sizes. Like we've read accounts of a woman who had a chicken in hers. So like these were capacious women, usually wore them in pairs. Through the period, I've studied a dress that I'm making a replica of, a net dress that actually still has a pocket slit. So even if the pocket wasn't in the dress, and that dress is from 1818, there's a slit at the side for a pocket or for something to be worn underneath. In this period, what you get is a move towards inserted pockets in women's clothing specifically. But these coexist at the same time as tie-on pockets, and at the same time as something like a reticule or a reticule, which is the precursor of the handbag. So this is essentially a really fancy pocket that you carry around on the outside. So all three of those types of pockets for women were available. And again, these are all in the Workwoman's Guide. So you would tie on your pocket underneath your clothing, and there would usually be a slit in the dress then to allow access to that. Then we have the dress. So the 1830s, I absolutely love. It's an extremely extravagant and over-the-top period. You get an awful lot of very bright prints, plaids, yes, cottons particularly. We do get a lot of cotton in the period, silks. Unfortunately, the industry has changed to such an extent now that we can't actually source the types of silks that were available at the time with the designs that they would have had at the time. So the dress is back opening, and you do still get front opening dresses, but like you do in the period get quite a.
You get the idea.
So the sleeves were the main point of fashion in this period.
Absolutely enormous.
So I have some fashion prints that show. So these are satirical fashion prints, and you get quite a lot of these from the Georgian period through into the mid-century. And basically a lot of these make fun of women's fashions and men's fashions occasionally. So you can see that obviously the satire here is the size of the sleeves and the bonnets. Again here. But they're quite a feature of the style at the time. Large bonnets, and it's an extremely extravagant silhouette. And so you might ask, how do we keep these sleeves out? And the answer is with sleeve puffers. So you have a lot of sleeve supports in this period to keep the nice shape. These ones would be filled with down or wool.
Keep your arms warm.
They're essentially like inflatable armbands, yeah.
Floaties.
So you would have them on the upper part of your arm. You can also get them where they're literally just made of sort of reed or boning of some kind. So like almost like a scaffolding. They come with ties, and I've actually seen it posted online as well. A lot of people ask, how do you get the dress over the sleeve? If you're wearing the sleeve, you would actually insert the this gets tied into the dress. and then you put it on.
Well, that makes sense. And just as an aside, we know Maria was keeping up with these fashions because in 1839, when she was 71 years old, 71 years old, she was climbing the ladder in her wardrobe and the ladder broke as she was at the top of it and she goes tumbling down. You can see she actually sketched herself in the huge dress of the period. You can see the sleeves, you can see the short bell shape of the skirt and the flippy-do little hairstyle of the period, which Carrie will also tell you about.
So as well as the large sleeves, larger skirts, what we get in this period is very tall hair. Again, I'll just take a picture of it. It's called the Apollo knot. So again, it's leading into the idea of fashions that are just very, very extravagant. So again, another satirical image of the sleeve being inflated to get up to the required size, but you can see the hair here. So this is an extremely fashionable young lady with her mother or a maid, and again, as Melissa had mentioned, wearing a cap on the inside of the house. So the Apollo knot is essentially this tall top knot of hair, and you'd have an infusion of curls around the front, lots and lots and lots of very heavy curls. Obviously, people of Maria's age weren't necessarily wearing that, so they would have a toned down version. But what you can see through the period is that hair tends to go back up to the top of the head. So you get bonnets then corresponding in shape, which have extremely wide brims, but because the hair is being worn on the top of the head, the crown of the bonnet moves to the top of the head. So these are extremely extravagant.
I love it.
I do love them, to be fair. But you see this quite a lot, and this would have been fairly regular. So for daytime wear. For evening, it doesn't change a huge amount. The neckline doesn't have to be covered up, but again, we get lots of accessories in the era, and you get an infusion of one of these white embroidered accessories. So again, this is another accomplishment that women could do. They could embroider their own caps, they could embroider their own little things. This is called a pelerine, and it's a specific type of shawl, I guess would be the best way to describe it. That would be worn, again, largely indoor. But you can see that you've got a very specific silhouette here of extremely wide shoulders, and this pelerine is adding to that wide shoulders. So when we look at dress, proportionality is a massive thing. So as Melissa said, in the Regency period, the waist is quite high, so it's not actually a focus necessarily of dress, because it's quite obscured. You're looking at the underbust is what the dress is cinching in on. As the period goes on into the 20s and into the 30s and the waist goes back down to the natural waist, you again find that there is an emphasis on the waist as a feature. So when you've got a narrow waist, you're emphasising that. Fashion sort of, I won't say naturally, but it does tend to then emphasise that. With the larger skirts and very wide shoulders, you get an even smaller looking waist.
The trick
by proportion, exactly. So you get quite a lot of fluff, quite a lot of lace. One thing that I'm not sure if you have noticed or not is that there's no drawers on this mannequin. So drawers really don't get worn a whole lot at all. They're pretty much only coming in this period. They're becoming much more common in the 1840s, and again you do find in the Workwomen's Guide, you find references to them and you find instructions for them. But Maria wouldn't have likely worn these until the 1840s. Really, they were becoming much more common then. So drawers are essentially a two-piece garment. They're two legs, crotchless, but they're essentially joined with a waistband. And if you can imagine, when you've got a corset on or anything that's quite tight like that, all of these layers of petticoats, going to the bathroom is going to be quite challenging if you have to try and remove an awful lot of that. So one of the bonuses of this kind of having just two joint legs is that you can do your necessary functions without necessarily disturbing your clothing to the extent that you might have to. And again, most of these are going to be made out of cotton or linen. We also get in the same period again chemsets, which can be worn under the dress. And then in the 1840s, things move to another extreme. So you kind of move slightly from romanticism to a slightly more gothic sensibility. So there's more of an emphasis on, sort of more sober, appearances. In terms of fabrics, silks would have been quite common. Silks, cottons, a little bit wools, the flannel still.
The flannel.
Flannel still.
Yeah.
It still lives.
And the young women still hate
Young
it.
women still hated it. I have a very, very lovely quote from an etiquette book, if you'll allow me to use my modern contraption, where someone is basically saying, and yet I blush to record it, there are young persons who will not wear a flannel waistcoat. Why? Because it increases the size of the waist. If it could be proved to this young person that flannel is important to her health, and if she still resists the obligations of duty and acts solely with references to appearance, she errs egregiously in dispensing with the flannel. So, yes, things, plus to Sean,
Exactly.
The more things change.
The young ones don't want to wear coats.
Again, a huge emphasis in this period on different neckerchiefs. So squares of fabric that you can jazz up a garment with and pop them over. Shawls, again, increasingly. Melissa's period, it would have been a bit of a conspicuous consumption thing where they're coming from India. But like most things, you get the knockoff versions, and you get a huge industry in Norwich and in Paisley in Scotland for basically versions of these shawls. So a lot of women wouldn't necessarily maybe have had the real thing, but you have massive industries, as I said, in the UK that are all based on the idea of not losing out on customs fees, and that you're centering industry in your own country rather than bringing it in from other places. You could finish off your look then finally with something like a belt, which again would just go around and emphasise the waist with a nice big buckle on it. And these would have been quite changeable. In terms of the 1840s, this is roughly what I'm wearing. So you can see that we've come down from the sleeves, and the skirts are still quite voluminous, but the overall silhouette has changed. So this would be basically the end of Maria's life, would have been this period where she's in her late 70s, and it's very, very different. So what you see happening in the 1830s is these voluminous sleeves, the fullness changes where it comes from the top and it starts to get pleated down. So you get a tightening of the sleeve at the top and then more of a balloon at the elbow. And then eventually this disappears altogether by the start of the 1840s. You have tight sleeves with a nice profile against the arm. The bodice as well has changed where you still have that triangular shape coming in, but it's a neater version basically. This in particular type of style is extremely popular at the time, and it's called a fan front. And the idea is that you have smocking or pleating of the fabric at the waist, and then it balloons out over the shoulders like a fan. And this would have been an extremely common style at the time. You can make it front opening, but again, back opening is what this dress is. And like Melissa said, friends, servants, ladies' maids, will be helping you change. You're moving more to hooks and eyes or hooks and thread bars for this kind of thing. Buttons really take a very long time to, like, even in the Tudor period, buttons were a very male thing. You have women pinning their clothes. You have women pinning their clothes all the way through this period, and largely there will be quite a lot of pins, but you're getting into hooks and eyes for fastenings on this. And buttons really do take a while to, like, it's very
1850s, 1860s.
Exactly. I find it funny how fossilized.
Were there wardrobe malfunctions with all these pins? Surely some things fall out.
Absolutely. Things fall out.
So no lady's retinue would be complete without some extra dress pins.
It's slightly earlier, but in the Palace of Versailles during the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, at every ball, and there was 2 balls a week held at Versailles as a minimum, they would have 2 women kind of in a side room that would specifically be there to help fix any wardrobe malfunctions. So they would have needles, thread, pins, what have you, to be like, oh, somebody stood on your train and ripped something off or some trim came undone. You just go and like quickly zip yourself up basically and be fixed. So yeah, wardrobe malfunctions are always a thing.
But you do your best to prevent it. And the thing as well is that at the end of the day, women are intimately familiar with how their clothing works. And a lot of things, you get these little like knacks of doing things. Again, in much later period, but there's a lot of very complicated openings on dresses from like the 1900s and the 1910s. And again, things where you are very conscious of the placement of your hooks and eyes to make sure that they're not likely to open, or your pins. As we move through, like this is essentially something very, very similar to what Maria would have been wearing this period. So women of the age, as Melissa had mentioned before, you don't want to look ridiculous by being too fashionable, but you also don't want to look ridiculous by not being fashionable enough. So women will keep an eye on fashion, but tone it down essentially for a much older age group. Again, you've got extremely dark fabrics, dark colours being chosen, browns, greys, kind of darker purples and blacks. One of the, I guess it's not a new technology at the time, but what it ends up having a massive boon at the time is roller printing. So this is a technology that's invented towards the end of the 1700s, but it becomes extremely well used, and it becomes a massive industry, mainly in Britain. And you get these fabrics printed where it's got a cylindrical roller that prints out different components of the design, but mechanized and industrialized. So obviously with the coming of the Industrial Revolution and things like that, you've obviously got like Lancashire would have been the huge centre for fabric and cotton mills, printing mills and things like that. So as I said, that the prints become, rather than being woven in there, not that they don't exist before this, but again you get this huge effusion of printed fabrics rather than woven in designs. Again, large shawls, such as this one. The size again of shawls is hard to really get an idea, but shawls were really, really, really large. So again, a lot of this is indoor wear or outdoor wear. Paisley designs, wool shawls and cashmere shawls. The shoes do change quite considerably. You get a much squarer toe. So these would be more evening slippers, and I don't know if anyone can see my
As opposed to the rounded toe.
As opposed to rounded toe.
Yeah.
It's difficult probably to see my shoes and I can't take them off, but again, quite a square toe. You get this like little Oxford style, and the shoes can often be foxed in leather. So they're a wool upper, and they have leather pieces at the toes, foxing. They're quite different from the. Well, I suppose not quite different, but they're different enough.
Yeah.
And you get boots as well, little ankle boots in the same style.
Show us your bonnet, Carrie.
Oh, I know.
So do you have your shawl on? No, leave your shawl on.
So bonnets, again, this is where you see quite a lot of the change. So hairstyles have descended back from the head, and they're largely placed on the back of the head. And again, trying to wear a bonnet that's got quite a tall brim when your hairstyle is centered at the back. So again, to kind of come back to a much more somber look, you've got a much more somber style of bonnet. So it resembles actually
the Pope bonnet. Very like it.
Yeah.
Basically 30-year change in fashion, and it came back in pretty much.
It's I love saying these things, but like, I mean, a lot of people would have noticed fashion is so cyclical.
Yeah.
You know, the 90s are becoming really, really popular with young people nowadays, and we all lived through the 90s. So, but it is fascinating, and you go from this sort of like narrow silhouette to a wider silhouette, back down to a narrower silhouette, and then with the 60s and the 70s, 1870s, you get much wider silhouette as well, but in different ways. So the bonnet definitely changes in shape. It does start the period with the taller brim, and this eventually just comes down and down and down until it's more like a poke bonnet.
So if you were going to a ball in all of these eras, you have experienced the dresses. Which of these years was dancing comfortably?
Oh, I'd say this one. I mean, I don't wear 6 petticoats in this one, so yeah.
I don't think, for me, it's not so much the thing. It's always just the length of the skirt. Like Melissa said, with the walking dress, where it's all about the length of the skirt. I've danced quite a lot in dresses that were just a little bit too long. You end up stepping all over it, and it's extremely inconvenient. So anything where there's a nice thing, but I
mean, talking about wardrobe malfunctions, like you said, Maria actually had a quote from earlier in the century, like 1804 sort of thing. She was at a ball and the man trod on a woman's gown, and she's like, "Sir, I would thank you to give me back my gown," basically. So I mean, it happened all the time, you know.
But you do see in the last period of Mariah's life as well, where it's a tendency towards the period itself tends towards a more sober sort of appearance, a more sober style of dress. Older women will probably have worn less trimming than a younger woman would, even though the clothing is essentially going to look the same. So again, through the period, this is where you get fashion magazines really coming to the fore. So fashion magazines did start quite a while before this, and these would have been subscription magazines that women generally would have gotten, and they would have included some prints of different fashions, kind of, I guess it's basically like Vogue, but women could take a part of the you kind of have to look at it as though, it's like high fashion nowadays. No one's really wearing that, but people are taking elements of it and adding it to their own everyday dress. And it would often have, descriptions of fashions from Paris or from London. And these really start to take off through the 1830s, and they really hit a stride in the 1840s. You have a number of different titles that are largely aimed at women. They start to become more like domestic magazines because they start to include little tips and tricks for taking care of your garments, with recipes for removing stains and things like that. So this would be a very typical fashion print of the period. So again, you can see it's this very kind of, I guess, winsome sort of appearance, very much in the sensibility of the 1840s. And most of these were, as I said, they were aimed at all ages of women, but largely the illustrations would show younger women. You do get ones where you've got somebody's mother in the picture, so it kind of shows an altered version of it for a slightly older lady as to how they could incorporate the dress. And you get these illustrations become much more detailed. They include more poses, and they start to have a more true representation of the fashions, where you have a national context going on. You've got people talking together. A lot of the times they'll show the views from the back, so somebody may be sitting there with their back to the viewer and somebody else standing, and again, it's a way to represent the different types of things. You start getting so I just have a few more pictures then as well, and again it just shows that with older women aren't essentially wearing a whole lot different from what younger women are wearing, just a different version of it. So again, one of the fashions of the time is this little ribbon. You see that in a huge number of portraits, photos. It's really popular. Nice fancy ribbon around the neck with a little brooch on it. And you can see here essentially that these women are doing the same. They've got their caps on, so this denotes them as older women. But and their dress is more restrained. It's going to have a slightly higher neckline, but there's not a massive amount of thing. Again, very dark colours, usually with a little collar. That marks the older woman. And then this is Mariah herself in this period. So unfortunately the photo's a little bit grainy. But as you can see, she's got a nice fashionable cap on. She's got some rounded at the front. So it was very important for women to keep abreast of fashion, even though they didn't slavishly follow it.
Yeah, perfect. We're going to take some questions now. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, before we're going to be kicked out of the room. So,
the clip that they wore.
Yes.
What was it made of? And why was it scarlet?
So this is made of broadcloth, which is a heavily fulled wool, which means that when you cut it, it does not fray at all. So I've cut pocket slits in here, and I have not hemmed this or faced it or anything. And the reason they were scarlet is, scarlet was very popular in the 18th century because it's a bright, eye-catching colour. And we think the reason it kind of remained in popularity in England and Ireland is because it's so grey here. And like this sort of bright, beacon of colour, like as you're outside, it's just very fetching, So it just looks really good.
Did they have other colours too?
Oh yeah, cloaks came in other colours, absolutely, but a surprising amount of images from this period still in particularly England and Ireland still shows the use of scarlet cloaks. But yeah, all colours were had. You're going to want like a good sober colour, like a black or a brown or something to hide any dirt if you're outside. Like maybe don't wear a lilac one, but basically be sensible about it.
Was the military an influence on that? Maybe the red coats and...
It could very well be. Considering especially the Napoleonic Wars were going on until 1815, they were on and off for that first 15 years. That could have, but they actually even lasted longer than that. So I don't know. And the Navy didn't wear scarlet. It was only like the infantry who did, and not all companies in the infantry wore it. Like you see a very dark green. Like if you've seen Sharp, you know, you see the dark green as well. The Navy tended to wear navy blue. So it could have something to do with that, but like England's naval power was also a huge feature of its national pride. So it wasn't just like the army, basically. We don't know. I think it's because it's eye-catching and very bright.
I feel like it's one of those things where like that it just becomes kind of fossilized.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's almost like a template. This is this garment, and it takes a lot for that to actually sort of change.
Yeah.
I'm saying, because you have different clothes, as you said, right?
You got the sail hood and all of that, yeah.
But for whatever reason, this becomes like a thing of its own, essentially. And you get clothes in the 1840s as well. They should become quite popular again with lots of different styles, names like burnous and things like that. I think Maria mentioned the burnous.
Oh, she might have.
Yeah, I think one of her lectures, somebody mentioned the burnous when you turn around.
Oh.
Could be Jane Austen or could be wrong. But yeah.
Any other questions?
Before fashion magazines, what was the driver of changing fashions? How did people know, like, this is the style now, rather?
Well, you know by seeing at that stage. So, like, the question of who precipitated the fashion is really something that has us all scratching our heads. Like, if we go back to the 16th century, let's say, where I would be, you know, that would be my expertise. There are no fashion plates, basically, you know, there's none of that. But like the Queen, the courtiers, or whatever, they're wearing something. Where do they get the idea from? We don't know. That's really the massive question mark, is like, where does the idea for things change? I mean, I suppose if you're like, say, fashion for ruffs, in the 16th century, they started out very demure, just a little ruffle at the top of a man's shirt and the top of a woman's partlet, which is kind of like a chamisette, the thing we've shown you. And then basically, as things goes on, people kind of are like, well, I can make my ruffle a bit bigger and a bit bigger and a bit bigger until it's like a dinner plate, you know, that's sticking out here. And then when you get things that are so big, we see this with fashion in the 1780s as well, you get things that are just huge hair, huge gowns, you know, just it's all the trim and all the lace and ruffles. And then you kind of get this not immediate, but not soon after, shift to the white and the straight and the up and down. And it's like the pendulum goes so far and then it just has to go the other way, because you can only get so much before it's like ridiculous and nobody wants to wear it anymore. And then it's usually, you see this like dramatic shift to something completely different, to like indicate a change in the in crowd, like those in the know, those who have taste, basically, in the 18th century phrase of it. And so we really don't know. It is a question for who dictated changes in fashion. It's like something in the air almost. Before the fashion plate, it's just like something, you might see somebody wearing something and you kind of adapt it.
Again, you've got letteration. People are reporting what they're seeing people wearing. You know, you've got people from, say, London or other large cities in Ireland, particularly, going back to their country houses and they're reporting back there. People around the area are saying, you know, a lot of this is just passed on, like you said, very, very visually.
Yeah.
But like, people are in correspondence all the time, particularly women are in correspondence all the time. And these are the things that occupy them, basically, is like all of these different changes. And like, you know, we were talking about correlation and causation on the way up, but you get like, with the going from sort of the very typical Georgian period into the Regency period, you, of course, in France at the time have the Revolution. You've got all of these ideas of, you know, the Roman republics. That's where you get an awful lot of influence on classical imagery, classical statuary, you know, trying to sort of ape the sort of the role of, you know, in its prime. And then you get the period where in sort of the 1830s and 1840s you've come away from the Republic. You're going back into periods where you've got you've got Bourbons again, you know, you've got a monarchy again, sort of through the 40s and 50s. And again, it's very much a case of, it's hard to tell how much is correlation, how much is causation. But again, these fashion trends do tend to swing with the politics of the period as well and what's going on politically. So yeah, something in the air.
Something is a zeitgeist, basically the spirit of the age, who knows?
Yeah.
Well, would they have had dress designers like?
So you had what were called, in 18th century France, you had what were called marchands du mode. So they would kind of be like like a stylist of the day. So they didn't actually make the gowns themselves, but they'd come along with their boxes of trim and ribbons and fripperies and laces, and they'd be like, okay, well, you've bought your fabric, but let's trim it like this, because you could trim a gown innumerable numbers of ways. So you did essentially have like professional stylists of the time, but a lot of it would be a collaborative work between a woman and either her mantua maker, which was the dressmaker, or even the tailor, if we're talking the riding habit, because they were pretty much always made by male tailors. So it would be like a collaborative process. She might bring in a fashion plate, or she might have seen somebody on the street and say like, oh, I really like it if we do a bit more poof at the, at the sleeve, or I want it like this sort of thing, and then the tailor goes off and does it, and there's a good bit of like discussion about it. So, but yeah, like as far as designers, we don't really get a designer until the 1860s, when Charles Frederick Worth goes to Paris and he opens up the House of Worth, and that's where we get what we would term a modern day designer, like a fashion house that puts out designs every year, not just drawings of them to inspire, but also recreates them, and then becomes a leader in fashion, and not just following what is kind of swimming in the atmosphere, so yeah.
Can I ask you about fabric? So how do we actually get do they have to go to Dublin, or are there peddlers, or how is that actually?
So women like Mariah often got their fabrics from bigger cities and towns. So she frequently asked, like if her brother was going up to Dublin, she'd frequently ask him, go here. And she had a mantua maker in Dublin that she liked to patronise. And so she would say, get this fabric from this crowd, this warehouse or whatever, and then take it over to Mrs. I can't remember her name right now, on Dawson Street, and basically have her make it to the pattern that she's got of me already. So like from that, we could guesstimate that basically like mantua makers would keep clients like patterns basically in like on some sort of file, essentially, to remake things, especially if they weren't living in the city and they were, 100 miles away in Edgeworthstown. So proxy shopping is what we academically call this process of sending somebody to purchase things for you. And Mariah had other people doing this for her. She did it for other people constantly. But like there would be dressmakers in every small town and village as well. There's a really beautiful letter I just recently transcribed where she went to visit her aunt, her aunt Ruxton, who lived outside of Navan, County Meath. And basically she tried a new mantua maker who just set up shop in this village that her aunt lived outside of, in her like big house. And the girl was only 16 and she was supporting her aged parents. But Mariah said like, oh, I'll definitely get her to make gowns for me again if I'm back staying with you, because she did such a great job and like the cost was really good and she was so fast and efficient at it. So like there probably was a mantua maker possibly in Edgeworthstown or maybe in Longford or, one of the, certainly Galway, but she preferred Dublin, like Dublin, Bath, London, all of them. She got them in the big three basically that were, and Paris. So yeah.
Maybe you wouldn't mind standing in the middle so you get a shot of you.
Do a quick, make sure nothing's fit check.
Yes, it's it. Fusion.
While you're getting your photograph taken, it was a really fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you. I know. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But what got you into, fashion history, or what?
I just love big dresses. I think when I was a child, I saw Cinderella. And like the whole transition from peasant to, queen, basically princess. I'm like, oh, dresses can change your life. So I don't know, but I just love a huge dress. I like taking up space.
Like we've been doing various historical things together for a very, very long period, and yeah, like I don't know what got me into it, but I think the more you get into it, the more you realize, like for me, a lot of it is the social aspect in terms of like the social history aspect, that like dress is such a reflection of, you know, individual people. It's a reflection of the times. It's a reflection of so many different things. And I just find that to be really, really relatable. Yeah, it's kind of one of my favorite things about it is just like that you can read so much into an outfit.
It's a great jumping off point because
Yeah.
everybody wears clothes,
Exactly.
you know, so we can all relate to wanting to be fashionable but not wanting to be seen ridiculous, and the price of it and taking care of it. Like, you know, where we get our clothing from is such a huge topic of conversation nowadays.
And sustainability.
And sustainability, yeah. So like it's just endlessly great jumping off point for so many aspects of life.
Sustainability particularly, because like people took such good care of their clothes. In the past, we're so used to fast fashion, we're so used to everything being extremely disposable. But like I said, you get references everywhere in letters and in diaries and things like that of, you know, clothes being literally picked apart, the fabric turned, if it was, you know, double-sided. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's such a short period of time that we're not actually doing that.
And was that because of cost?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much. If the fabric is still good, you're going to still use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you get dresses from kind of this period, the 1840s, 1850s, where these big prints were coming back in. So you get people whose grandmother's clothes were in their attic and they're starting to use that fabric because a lot of the 1780s and things would have had these very large chintzy prints, and this again cyclical, it comes back into fashion. So you find ones where we can tell those dresses have been picked apart from an earlier style and remade for the 1840s and the 1850s. Like the labour was relatively cheap compared to the cost of the fabric at the time. So.
And actually, to have any gown not be reused was considered a failure of economy. So gowns that we see in museums nowadays, like realistically, the people who bought them and wore them were probably like, oh crap, I can't reuse this thing I spent all this money on. And if it's just sitting in a chest somewhere waiting a couple hundred years, you know, to be given to a museum, like that was a huge portion of their income that they didn't get the full wear out of that gown. That would be seen as like kind of a failure on their part to economize properly and to reuse the gown in some current way.
Yeah. So like that workwoman's guide that I mentioned would have had instructions in the back. It would have had recipes for, you know, how to treat spot stains, different recipes for, so one thing I didn't get to was with linens, particularly in the 1840s, like you have, like Melissa said, huge numbers of linens, and then with sort of industrialization and consumption picking up in the middle of the century, you got these like this massive profusion of linens of all kinds, but they would have been marked for laundering. Like we could probably do a whole other talk.
Practices, absolutely.
But people will a lot. So there's recipes for the ink to mark your laundry for when it goes to the laundress. But there's also a recipe for if you accidentally mark something to get the stain out. But just how to literally it gives instructions on how to look after your clothes and stuff. And it's just it was stuff that was considered essential to know. Like you would never have something made and wear it without knowing either yourself to do it or instruct a servant on how to look after it, how to brush it out, when it should be washed, you know, if it should be washed, basically. So those kind of things. It's essential information.
Just to say that we have 8 family albums. Actually, one of them is put away today, but this one here is the most recent. And the family capture a lot of images from social history here in Edgeworth. So, and there is fashion, that one in particular there. So these are reproductions from the Bodleian Library and the Habsburg Library in Notre Dame. So these are 3 albums, and there's over 100 pages of images. So you can't catch the fashion today.
Oh, amazing! I'll have to look at that.
These albums. Might be for another occasion.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds great. Well, I'm afraid we have to kick you out.
Yeah.